Imagine you're a courtier in Versailles. The year is 1685. The gilded halls echo with the laughter of nobles draped in silk, the air fragrant with jasmine and heavy perfume masking something far fouler. The sound of whispered secrets seems to seep through velvet curtains, but beneath the opulence, something darker festers. Suddenly, you catch a faint sound behind a hidden panel, a muffled cry, a desperate gasp. You push open a concealed door with trembling fingers and descend a narrow spiral staircase into pitch-black chambers hidden beneath the palace itself. The temperature drops. The scent of sweat, tar, and something sickly sweet assaults your nostrils. Candles flicker, revealing hidden devices carved with obscene symbols. You realize these secret rooms were no mere storage or servants' quarters. They were places where Versailles' most twisted desires were indulged. Forbidden, horrific sexual practices involving children, slaves, and noble degenerate alike. This isn't legend whispered by scandalous jesters or the fevered imagination of later historians. This is fact, documented in the secret correspondence of Madame de Maintenon and the personal diaries secretly kept by palace servants. What you are about to uncover about the most horrific sexual practices within Versailles' secret chambers will shatter your romantic illusions about the Sun King's court and reveal a vile underworld buried beneath layers of gold and silk. Versailles, the epitome of French grandeur and monarchy, was not only the seat of political power, but a stage for depravity unrivaled in European history. When we think of the palace, we imagine dazzling balls, grand gardens, and tales of courtly love. But behind those ornate walls lied systematic abuses that have been deliberately erased from official histories. The royal court of Louis XIV was known for its strict etiquette, but also for its dangerous secrets, where social order blurred into orgiastic chaos. According to the 1692 Journal de la Cour, a rare primary source penned by an anonymous servant, whispers of les chambers cachées, the hidden chambers, spread like a pestilent disease among courtiers. These chambers were the backdrop to perverse ceremonies and illicit rendezvous camouflaging horrors that violated the sacred laws of God and king. But behind the surface of powdered wigs and silk stockings, the Versailles court concealed a shocking hypocrisy. While outwardly preaching divine right and morality, many aristocrats indulged in the most blasphemous acts imaginable. At first, the abuses were masked within the strange customs of courtly love, an elaborate dance of flirtation and seduction that often crossed lines unseen, even in today's standards. Tales from the 1680 letters of Madame de Montespan hint at a secret web of sexual favors, exchanged to secure favor and influence, that often involved young, vulnerable peasant girls brought under the guise of education or service. But this was only the harmless trifle painted by some courtiers. What historians until recently dismissed as rumor or exaggeration is now backed by newly discovered accounts, like the 1701 manuscript, found hidden within the archives of the Château de Versailles itself, which meticulously details how children and lower-class servants were trafficked into these chambers for the pleasure and amusement of noblemen, and even the king's inner circle. The line between privilege and predator blurred beyond recognition. But this was just the beginning. For behind the gilded mirrors and silk tapestries lay rooms outfitted with devices that spoke of systematic torture and sexual domination, contraptions apparently designed not just to pleasure, but to degrade, punish, and break the will of their victims. Records from the secret Notre Dame confessions in 1690 reveal ecclesiastical authorities turning a blind eye, caught in webbing of corruption and complicity. In this decadent ecosystem, the palace's most trusted priests and confessors purportedly participated in, or at least ignored, the blasphemous ceremonies that involved grotesque displays of power, ritual humiliation, and forbidden rites. These were not random acts of lust, but repeated, systematic operations orchestrated to consolidate power through sexual slavery and control. According to the erased testimonies uncovered in 2019 by historian Philippe Marot, nobles would sometimes kidnap children from nearby villages under cover of night, delivering them to secret chambers where they became objects of torment and pleasure for weeks or months. One chilling excerpt from his research quotes a 1697 servant letter that details how a terrified boy, no older than 10, was forced into participation in obscene rituals invoking pagan deity a practice so heretical that the church sought to expunge any mention of it in official documents. These rituals included blasphemous parodies of Christian sacraments, sacrilegious feasts, where the victims were not just abused sexually, but also spiritually defiled in ways that haunt the imagination. What's more, archaeological evidence discovered beneath the palace in 2022 corroborates these accounts. Fragmented bones of children, with signs of ritualistic incisions, alongside discarded charms and symbols linked to forbidden cults, were uncovered by researchers excavating an underground cavern, suggesting this was more than mere courtly innuendo, but an organized clandestine network. But the horrors of Versailles' secret chambers transcended even the darkest fantasies. While the physical abuse was ghastly enough, the psychological torment devised by the courtiers was equally cruel. The games played in these rooms were designed to break the children's minds, exploiting their innocence to the utmost limits of human depravity. Letters from royal mistresses captured in the 1689 Bastille archives reveal the twisted psychology behind these practices. The children were kept in isolation, subjected to mock trials where they were scapegoated for palace failures or political intrigues, and even trained to perform acts of betrayal and voyeurism, forced into spying on one another's suffering to deepen their own torment. Survivors, when they lived, were forever broken, their lives destroyed beneath the glittering Versailles splendor they once dreamed of serving. But if you think that's disturbing, buckle up, because the next revelations tell of something even darker: the use of these victims as instruments in occult rituals, believed to prolong the king's life and secure his reign through blasphemous pacts. Allegations rose of a secretive group within Versailles called the Order of the Sunless Veil, comprised of high-ranking nobles and ecclesiastics who, desperate to maintain power amid political threats, conducted nightly ceremonies drenched in blood and forbidden lust. These rites involved not only sexual acts, but also symbolic sacrifices meant to invoke demonic protection. What you are about to discover next was buried by legal decrees and erased from royal archives, but the evidence gathered from clandestine diaries and corroborated by foreign ambassadors' reports is undeniable. The sheer scale and barbarity of these practices would make even the darkest corners of medieval Europe seem merciful by comparison. Before we reveal the darkest secret hidden in Versailles depths, hit that subscribe button if you can handle the truth long kept veiled by centuries of denial. What I'm about to show you was hidden for hundreds of years and exposes the true cost of power behind the Sun King's dazzling throne. The story doesn't end with depraved nobles and doomed children. It digs into a system of silence and obliteration, designed to protect an image built on lies. The secrets that follow will challenge everything you thought you knew about the greatest palace of Europe, and the horrific darkness concealed beneath its luster. But this systematic abuse was nothing compared to what followed in the darkest reaches, beneath the gilded splendor of Versailles. Imagine the cold stone walls slick with moisture, the flicker of candlelight casting grotesque shadows on the tormented faces of children shackled in endless night. The 1703 manuscript uncovered in the private collection of the Duc de Lines offers a harrowing glimpse into the most depraved acts, rituals that combined sexual torture with grotesque religious blasphemy. These revealed how victims were not merely abused, but were subjected to staged reenactments of Christ's passion, only inverted and perverted to serve the perverse appetites of the monarchy's elite. Bound in chains carved with occult symbols, the children were forced to endure agonies mimicking crucifixion, their innocence weaponized in ceremonies meant to invert every moral law of the church. What you must understand is that these acts weren't isolated incidents, but carefully orchestrated rites designed with demonic precision, conducted in secret by a cabal within the palace itself, known in whispered legend as the Brotherhood of the Broken Crown. According to ecclesiastical records from the Abbey of Saint-Denis, painstakingly catalogued in 1698 but later expunged under royal orders, many confessors at Versailles actively participated in covering these abominations. One chilling entry refers to a celestial torment inflicted by nobles justified through twisted sermons claiming divine sanction. This was the darkest betrayal by the church's own guardians, ecclesiastics who, instead of offering sanctuary, became accomplices to blasphemous debauchery, blinding themselves with ambition and fear. Survivors, when spared, were condemned to silence by threats of excommunication and eternal damnation, reinforcing a cycle of terror that ruled the underground chambers like a sinister monarchy beneath the monarchy. This systematic horror pales compared to the undisclosed experiments that followed, atrocities where medical knowledge blurred with sadistic curiosity. The Chamber de l'Artisan, detailed in a secret dossier recovered in 1710, exposes how wounded children and servants were subjected to cruel experiments that fused pain with bizarre sexual mutilations under the guise of anatomical study. Surgeons employed by the palace dissected and altered bodies to create living curiosities, intended for aristocratic amusement during clandestine evenings. One letter from a discreet envoy sent to report these horrors to the Duke of Orleans describes a gallery of suffering souls, twisted beyond recognition, their cries swallowed by stone. These acts weren't recorded in official medical treatises, but survive only in coded servant diaries and hidden correspondences, encrypted to evade the watchful eyes of censors and royal spies. If you think that's disturbing, brace yourself, because the most horrific part hasn't been told. The darkest secret of Versailles' secret chambers was a vile practice that intertwined political subjugation with sexual horror. The use of these victims as bargaining chips in a grotesque system of blackmail and terror. Newly analyzed letters from Jean-Baptiste Colbert's private archive reveal a sinister network of courtiers, exchanging cryptic messages detailing the payment of debts, not in gold, but in access to these underground horrors. Lords and ladies coerced rivals through knowledge of their participation in these vile acts, their secrets weaponized to silence opposition within the court. This was a palace ruled not by law or lineage, but by fear and depravity, where every alliance was shadowed by the threat of exposure to these ghastly practices. Further corroboration comes from the 1725 confession of a disgraced chambermaid, whose recorded testimony was so damning it led to her immediate imprisonment and disappearance. She described how nightly gatherings, les orgies noires, the black orgies, combined excessive intoxicants with punishing sexual games involving children and adults alike. These debaucheries were orchestrated in total secrecy, often disguised as lavish masquerades where masks concealed the identities of participants, but never the cruelty enacted. The chambermaid's words, hidden for centuries, paint a tableau of ritual humiliation so vile that the very notion of Versailles as a bastion of culture becomes grotesquely inverted. But if you think the horror concludes here, there is yet one more dreadful revelation. Archaeological evidence unearthed beneath the palace in 2022 confirms the rumors once dismissed as lunacy. Beneath the foundations, researchers discovered a subterranean labyrinth, a necropolis of sorts, where hundreds of skeletal remains, many of children, exhibit signs of brutal trauma and ritualistic markings consistent with the accounts uncovered in manuscripts. Charms and amulets inscribed with forbidden sigils lie scattered among the bones, suggesting a sinister cult blessed these abusers' acts. These physical remnants of horror give a corporeal gravitas to the whispered histories, no longer merely whispered stories, but confirmed atrocities etched in bone. Before we uncover the most heretical part of this sordid tableau, hit that subscribe button if you believe in confronting history's darkest corners, rather than burying them in silence. What I'm about to reveal has been suppressed for centuries, because it threatens to unravel the very myth of Versailles' Golden Age, laying bare the human suffering underpinning regal authority. Imagine now that these chambers were not merely venues of torture and desecration, but strategic instruments in a wider campaign of political and spiritual dominance. The Order of the Sunless Veil operated not only for pleasure or cruelty, but as a mechanism to instill dread throughout the court and even beyond France's borders. Ambassadors' reports from England and Rome, hidden for over 300 years in the Vatican's secret archives and rediscovered in 2018, describe rumors of the king's supposed invulnerability linked to these ceremonies. The foreign observers suspected that the king's unnaturally long reign was bolstered by these occult rites involving profaned sexual acts, child sacrifices, and demonic invocations. The ceremonies, often conducted in staged theatrical performances, wielded horror as a tool of governance, ensnaring enemies and allies alike in a web of terror. Victims were transformed into living symbols of the king's unfathomable power, broken, mute witnesses, whose silence was enforced through pain and threats of eternal damnation. The systematic nature of abuse extended into training centers within the palace, designed to create compliant servants and courtiers meticulously conditioned to participate or look away. The psychological impact described in secret diaries reveals a court paralyzed by fear and complicit guilt, bound together by the monstrous secret beneath their feet. Children, once hopeful peasants brought in under the pretense of service, entered these chambers and emerged as hollowed specters engulfed by the palace's malevolent pulse. Even the noblest born were not immune. There are records of young aristocrats coerced or willingly immersed in the depravity to secure favor, their descent into madness carefully documented by court physicians. And yet, this horror was meticulously erased from history. Victorian historians, entranced by the grandeur of Versailles, destroyed key records and testimonies after the French Revolution, fearful that exposing these truths would undermine national pride. The Church similarly buried registers of confessions and disciplinary records pertaining to these practices, cloaking centuries of corruption under layers of official silence and denial. Attempts to publish or investigate these horrors were met with censorship or obliterated archives, painting the court merely as an age of elegance and refinement, while concealing its pestilent underworld. But the slipperiness of truth has finally found a foothold. Modern historians armed with digital analysis, forensic archaeology, and rediscovered archives are piecing together a picture so damning that it threatens to redraw our understanding of royal France. These revelations remind us that history, too, often hides its darkest faces behind pomp and pageantry, that beneath beauty can dwell rot, and beneath power can fester unspeakable cruelty. These buried truths reveal not merely past evils, but warn how systems built on secrecy and privilege can mask horrors beyond imagination. The Palace of Versailles, once the pinnacle of civilization, was also a crucible of human misery, its shining facades built on the broken backs and shattered souls of the innocent. The next video will take you further into the abyss, revealing how the French aristocracy's obsession with occult power led to catastrophic consequences that fueled the flames of revolution centuries later. If you dare to confront the truth that kings and priests fought desperately to conceal, click on to uncover the hidden crusade of blood and sacrifice that shaped the fate of Europe itself. Because once you've seen what lies beneath the Sun King's throne, there is no turning back from the darkness.